Hello, and welcome back to the Yu-Gi-Oh! Discussion Series Part 2. You all tuned in for the last episode where I talked about Pure Zoo as a deck, and in this episode I would like to talk about Dogmatika Zoo. So this entire series is focusing on Zoodiac as a whole and its different variations in deck building. Tier-wise, I would like to put Pure Zoo, I think, at the top, which is why I made that my first video. It's something I'm very comfortable talking about. I'm very comfortable playing that build. It's just all around a really nice control deck. It feels good, smooth when you play it, not very clunky. It doesn't really play any bricks or anything like that. So it's just like very, very neat as a deck. Secondarily here, I think the second best version is Dogmatika Zoo. We'll get into that when we kind of get into the deck discussion here, but it's also still very control heavy. This build has, I would say, more ways to remove resources from your opponent than Pure Zoo does, but it is also more skill intensive. So I think for beginners playing Zoo, this might not be the version you want to go with. I would play Pure, familiarize yourself with the deck and the playlines a little bit better, and then maybe experiment with Dogmatika Zoo as a deck. Third in this list will be Eldritch Zoo, which will be the next video. That deck also is in the same vein as Dogmatika Zoo, where it is really good at removing resources from your opponent. The deck is a little clunkier than Dogmatika Zoo and a lot clunkier than Pure Zoo. You play a lot of purple cards, a lot of trap cards in that deck. If you're going second, those purple cards really do nothing. They don't interact literally until your opponent's next turn because you have to have a turn to set them before you can do anything with them. It does have spot removal in the form of Golden Lord, which is nice, but at that point, you're going to have a lot more clunky hands. And then fourth and final on this list will be the Tri-Brigade version of Zoodiac. That deck in and of itself is unique in the sense where Zoo and the Tri-Brigade cards are just more or less engines in the same deck. There's no real archetype in that deck taking a larger presence than the other. It's very similar. The card type for both archetypes, is very similar. While they're, Wing Beast, Beast, and Beast Warrior cards, you have to know different play lines. And in that deck itself, there's also 3 different versions of it. And I'll talk more on that. I think next week is when I'll be making that video. So stay tuned for that. It'll be an interesting topic to, to go over with you guys. Very thought-provoking. I'm hoping it's going to be. So while we're here, we'll just go over the deck list, and then I'll kind of give my closing thoughts once we cover these cards. So starting off here, we have PSY-Frame Driver. It's definitely the card you always want to open. You can only play it at 1. Konami just limited this card into the ground. It's basically an auto win if you see it, and I'm fucking lying. You guys know this card is terrible to draw in your opening hand, and it's really only good if you draw it if you also have Gamma in your opening hand. Even then, you feel like a fucking loser when you draw it because it's just a dead card. If you're not activating Gamma, then you have 2 dead cards in your hand. It's just not great. But Gamma, in and of itself, is still worth running because it's such a high impact hand trap. It does so much. It not only negates an effect of your opponent's monster, but it also removes that resource. It destroys it, and it puts a body on board. I know I talked a little bit about high impact hand traps in the last video, those being cards like Nibiru, Gamma, Ogre are also high impact hand traps. They're cards that do multiple things. They remove a resource from your opponent while also negating a card. Ogre doesn't really negate cards when it destroys them, but field spells, continuous spells, I should preface that, face up continuous spells and face up continuous traps have to be face up on the field to resolve their effects. If you've ever cycloned one of those cards on activation, then you know that once that resource is removed from the field, it does not resolve. So if Ogre is used on any of those activating effects while they were already face up, they do not resolve. So I definitely consider Ogre a high impact hand trap, but it's behind Gamma and then behind Nibiru. So it does multiple things, puts bodies on board. In another deck, if you were playing Gamma, if you resolve this card, it's technically a 1-card Needle Fiber because it's a tuner, and then Driver is a non-tuner monster, so you can go into Halka-Fibrax, not Needle Fiber. But you know what I mean. So going back into more high impact hand traps, we have Nibiru. I talked about this in the last video. It just clears opponents' boards, makes them have to have more resources to be able to play through it. Just really good in general, gives you a 3k body, does so much. Now, Fleur de Lis is the one kind of quote-unquote brick for the Dogmatika engine. You don't really want to see this card in multiples. One, because it's just searchable. Two, because it doesn't do anything unless you have an extra deck monster on the field, or if you also have an Ecclesia in tandem with that extra deck monster, because it only gets its negate effect if you have another Dogmatika monster on the field. So you have to have Ecclesia on the field to resolve its negate effect. Now, one thing that does definitely make it worth playing is the fact that its negate effect does not target. It activates in hand, summons, and then negates. So if your opponent asks for a target, be like, oh, sorry, champ, this does not target, and then you're just free to negate whatever you want to. I'm not really going to explain the Zoodiac monsters too much because I did touch on them in the last video, so I'll just go over these ratios really quick and then get back to Ecclesia, since she's next in line here. But 3 Thoroughblade, 3 Whiptail, 2 Ram, and then 1 Rapier. I wanted to make room for the second punishment. Like I said, I'll talk about that when I get to it. And while you still have like a ton of zoo monsters, you know, you have Tenki to search for them. You're gonna open up multiples, hopefully. So missing 1 Ram's not going to be too impactful. And testing it hasn't been. I really haven't missed the 3rd Ram. It's just one of the ratios that you can freely mess with is your number of Zoodiac monsters. So let's touch on Ecclesia real quick. She can be special summoned from your hand while you control an extra deck monster. And when she's normal summoned or special summoned, you can add 1 Dogmatika card from your deck to your hand. So you can add Fleur de Lis, you can add Punishment. Unfortunately, you cannot add Nadir Servant. I've seen people try to do that, but its name is Nadir Servant, not, Nadir Servant of the Dragma or Dragma Nadir Servant or something like that. So you cannot add Nadir to your hand, but you can add any of the other cards. And usually, using her effect, you will be adding your missing piece. Punishment is usually the card that you want to add off of this, because if you've activated Nadir Servant in the turn, you'll be sending your Titaniclad, and then Titaniclad can either add or special summon any of the Dogmatika monsters from your deck. So, one other thing about Ecclesia that I think a lot of people still forget, even though this deck has been out for a while, is the fact that she cannot be destroyed by battle by any card special summoned from the extra deck. So I've seen people online with a defense position Ecclesia on the field, and then some guy uses his Macabre to run over it, and the guy just sends Ecclesia to grave, and the other guy doesn't correct him because, I mean, who would in that instance? But it's very important to remember that she cannot be destroyed by battle by any extra deck monster. So just keep that in the forefront of your mind while she's on the field. Gonna move back down here to Ash. It's not technically a high impact hand trap or anything like that, but it does hit power cards like any of the pot cards or a sold, after they've sent from the deck from cost, you can Ash it. It's multi-purpose, stops a lot of power cards in the game, and I think is just generally good to play. So, Gamba's next, but we talked about Gamba when we talked about Driver. High impact hand trap, removes a resource from the field, also does the negating effect, and also puts bodies on board. So, really good. So now we're going to move on to Nadir Servant, which is the card I was talking about when I was talking about Ecclesia. Nadir Servant sends 1 monster from your extra deck to the graveyard and then adds 1 Dogmatika monster or Fallen of Albiz monster from your deck or graveyard to your hand. That is extremely, extremely important because if you're in the grind game and you've burned through your Ecclesias and your Fleur de Lis and they're in the graveyard and then you top deck a Nadir Servant, that is not bad. I've seen people moan and groan about this every time that they're in like a top decking situation and they draw Nadir Servant. You can add back those cards from graveyard and it's really, really good. It's very, very good. If anything, you're just going to put a body that's hard to get over on the field, or you can put Fleur de Lis on field, if the game state allows you to. I think the part that a lot of people also overlook on this is this has similar text to Punishment, but when you're sending the monster from your extra deck to the graveyard, you can only add one of those monsters that has attack less than or equal to the sent monster in the graveyard. So it checks the monster in the graveyard and then adds. And then for the rest of the turn after this card resolves, you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck for the rest of that turn. So, and it's also an activate once per turn, so you can only activate this card once per turn. If this card gets judgmented, which negates the activation, and you have a second copy, you can play the second copy after that. So, always good to remember that you lock out of your extra after you activate this. I've seen people activate this to bait and negate. It doesn't get negated, and they normal summon a zoo monster and try to overlay on top of that. You cannot do that, and then you've just wasted your turn because now you've wasted your normal summon. You can't get an extra deck monster on board to summon Ecclesia out of your hand, and then they just kind of fumble after that. So be very cautious of that. Next, we're going to have 3 Pot of Avarice. I know this ratio might look a little weird. I'm sure some of you were probably expecting cards like Pot of Desires instead of Avarice. I just feel like with cards you're playing 2 of, hand traps that require you play a brick to resolve them, you just don't want to take the Banish 10 risk. And since this deck has more powerful turn 1 plays and follow-ups than Pure Zoo does, you're just going to want to be like recycling your resources more than drawing into them, because once you have one resource, it's just going to keep kind of chugging along, and Avarice is just going to be shuffling back extra deck monsters or cards like Ecclesia and Fleur de Lis just to kind of make your Nadir Servants live. Multi-purpose, still a draw 2, still really good. I would play 3 of this. You can find room for Desires if you want to, but I wouldn't recommend it personally. We're going to move on to Book of Moon, which, just like in the last video, I think Book of Moon is extremely good. I see it as an offensive hand trap. Baits, negates, outs, both Buster Locks. The 2 Buster Locks being the Buster Dragon Lock and then the Buster Whelp Lock. The Buster Whelp Lock is the one that they equip from their deck to Savage Dragon, giving it 1,000 additional attack with Union Carrier, locking you out of your extra deck. The Buster Dragon Lock is the one that the Buster Blader deck uses, where they summon Buster Dragon, the Synchro monster that turns all of your monsters into Dragon-type monsters, and then Fusion summon, using the trap effect in the graveyard, the Buster Fusion monster, which makes it to where I think the text says Dragon monsters cannot activate their effect. So if they're chaining that trap card to the activation of one of your monsters on the field, even though it's currently Dragon, that'll be Chain Link 1, your monster's effect will be Chain Link 1, the trap in the grave is Chain Link 2, putting Buster on the field. Your effect will not be negated, because if this card reads Dragon-type monsters' effects can't be negated, or can't be activated, your card has already activated. The only thing it's doing is resolving, so your effect will resolve. I've seen people lie about this on Dueling Book all the fucking time recently, and it just blows my mind that people lack the ability to read. I mean, Yu-Gi-Oh! Players have been proven time and time again that they can't read, but this is just something super basic, like, read the goddamn text, man. Not hard. So I'm going to move on. I don't want to keep ranting about this because I'm going to get really pissed off at these people. It's insane. But 1 copy of Zoodiac Barrage, just because the card's at 1. It does so much. I mean, I talked about it last video. I don't really need to talk on it too much. But if it was at multiples, this deck would just be like tier 0. Then we have 3 Tenki. It's the Rhoda for the deck. If Rhoda was a 3, you'd play it. This searches pretty much all of your Zoo cards. It's really, really good. Impermanence, I failed to talk about this in more detail in the last video, but Impermanence, while not technically a high impact hand trap, it does multiple things. One, you can activate it from your hand while you control no cards, target one face-up monster on the field, and negate its effects until the end of the turn. But if this card is set and then activated, it also negates all spell and trap cards activated in that column. So you can catch your opponent off guard pretty easily with this if you're in the grind game and they're getting flustered. You can activate this, and I've seen people do this, and I've done this myself, where I activate it, negate one of my opponents, like let's just say Alistair, and then he throws the Desires in that column, or better yet, an invocation that he drew in that column. It is negated by Impermanence. But one thing to note is while it does negate cards in your opponent's column, it also negates cards in the zone that Impermanence was activated in, because technically any card that's placed in that column is still a card in that column, whether you want to argue against that or not. So I've also seen people negate their own card effects by mismanaging their columns. Just one thing to really keep in mind when you're playing this card. And then lastly, we have Dogmatika Punishment. This card's good at 2 because this version of Zoo is just really good at spot removal, and I think it's the better version going first just because it can do more, not as good going second, which is why I kind of put more hand traps in this build. But Punishment technically can remove 2 resources by sending cards from your extra deck, and the card that you'll want to send to get the additional interruption is Elder Entity Natis. But we'll get to that in a second. Dogmatika Punishment has a lot of text on this card, and there's a lot of things that you need to realize when you're playing this card. So it targets one face-up monster your opponent controls as cost. Then, it sends one monster with an equal or higher attack from your extra deck to the graveyard, and if you do that, you destroy that monster. So, one reason people lose to this card a lot in the mirror match is because they don't realize that they have Dryden on the field, and they pop the card that your opponent targeted with Dogmatika Punishment. They don't get the send from the extra deck, so they don't get the additional pop, or if they send Titanic Cloud, they're not going to get that search on the end phase, because that monster is no longer face up on the field, and it has no attack. all these monsters have attack value. Once you remove that monster from the field, there's no monster and there's no attack for it to read. So you cannot send anything with an equal or higher attack from your extra deck to the graveyard. So a good example, if they target your Trident Chainlink 2, pop itself, they don't get the send, and then they're locked out of their extra deck because after this card resolves, you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck. You can only activate one copy of Dogmatika Punishment per turn. Same thing as Nadir Servant. So what happens is if they judgment this card and you have the second copy, you can feel free to activate the second copy after the judgment resolves, anytime after that. So card's really good, great interruption. We'll translate. We will move seamlessly into the extra deck now, talking about Elder Entity Natis because it's one of the cards that you want to send off Dogmatika Punishment. When it's sent to the graveyard, it targets one card on the field and pops it. Doesn't have to be face up. Dogmatika Punishment does have to be face up, and it does have to be a monster. This doesn't care what card it is. As long as it's on the field, it can pop it. So we're going to have PSY-Frame. Actually, we're going to have Titaniclad next. Titaniclad is the final, if you want to call it a Dogmatika monster that you play. It is not technically a Dogmatika card, but it functions with them and then the fallen, quote-unquote, fallen archetype. When it is sent to the graveyard at the end of the turn, so at your end phase, it adds a Fallen of Albaz or Dogmatika monster from your deck to your hand, or summons it to the field. So if you don't have an extra deck monster on board and you resolve Nadir Servant sending this card, the play to make would be to special summon Ecclesia if you weren't able to summon it from your hand, and then use Ecclesia's effect to search your missing piece. So Fleur de Lis, most likely. Make sure you're special summoning Ecclesia in defense mode because if your opponent has an extra deck monster, they won't be able to run it over. But that is why you play one copy of this card. It's just a good card to send off of Nadir Servant going first. Then we have Omega. Omega is a level 8 synchro that you can make if you resolve Gamma on your first turn. It's a card that lets you banish a card out of your opponent's hand randomly, and its graveyard effect, if sent off Dogmatika Punishment, is you can shuffle it and a card in either player's graveyard into the deck. So it can remove resources like a Miscellaneous Aurus in your opponent's grave, or any Dragonlink card that you don't want your opponent to have, or any Warrior monster in the Infernoble matchup that you don't want them recycling. So Gearfried would be an example of that. Really, really good card in the graveyard as well. It's a little bit beefier than Titaniclad and Natis, so it has a little bit of relevance there. Where if your opponent has a monster that's 2,800 or less than that, then you could send Omega instead of these three because these three wouldn't answer that card. So moving along to Zeus, same theory as Pure Zoo. Zeus is just a really good card. I would play multiples just because if they can strike the first copy and you don't have a way to average it back, you still want to have access to it. And the extra deck is a little flexible, and it's flexible enough to play the second copy of Zeus, I would say. So it's definitely worth playing two copies. You know what it does? You can overlay on top of an Xyz monster you control if an Xyz monster has attacked this turn. So in your main phase 2, you overlay him, and you detach 2 material from him to not nuke the board, because that kind of implies destruction, but it sends all the cards on the field except itself to the graveyard. So it does out cards with destruction protection, like Dragoon, so it's just in general very, very good. And it's also, that effect is not once per turn, so if you have 4 material on that card, you can activate it, beta negate, chain its effect again. Really, really stupid card. Then we have Drill Driver. Same reason as why you would play this in your standard zoo list. It kind of floats. It's good to overlay on top of a zoo card. Does piercing damage. Weird scenarios where that matters. It's just a good card to have. Now we have 2 Tiger Mortar, 2 Chalkanine, 1 Trident, and 2 Borbo. These are just the better ones to play because they actually do stuff. I was playing 1 copy of Borbo and 1 copy of Hammer Kong. Hammer Kong's effect just never comes up. I just really never make it for its purpose of protection. So Borbo is just better in this scenario because it lets you get into Zeus quicker, and then the other ratio is just standard. So lastly, we have Megaclops. I see a lot of people not playing Megaclops in the Dogmatika Zoo build, and I see why. You're not really gunning to make this card, you're really just controlling your opponent more with the Dogmatika cards. But you can still make this card. It's still really hard for a lot of decks to get over, and it's also a card that outs itself in the mirror match in the form of Dogmatika Punishment. Dogmatic Dogmatika Punishment can send Megaclops from the extra deck to the graveyard to target your opponent's Megaclops and destroy it. So there's a little bit of additional application in, conjunction with it just being a really big card and kind of hard to out in most matchups. Let's move to the extra deck finally. In Pure, I did play 2 copies of Zoo King Alpha and 1 Pankratops. I sung their praises, and I still think they are excellent cards. I don't see why you wouldn't side deck these cards, especially if you're going second. Not only are they removal, they are big beat sticks that can get over problem cards. They're inherent summons, so they don't start chains, so Dragoon can't negate their summon. Just really, really good cards in general. Lancia, because it makes the Dragon Link matchup a lot easier. It's very hard for them to play if they're not able to get their banish rolling. They can't summon cards like Chaos Levineer. They can't summon cards like the Collapse Serpent and Wyvern Buster Dragons. So it's really hard for them to kind of get the ball rolling without being able to banish. It's also a free win against Dinos because they can't use Miscellaneous Source and they can't use Pill, and if they're not using those cards, what kind of interruption are they putting on the board? They're not. Giant Rex can't get banished. They can't put a rank 4 on board. It's really just more of a normal summon Archosaur effect. Oh, Lancia? Okay, pass. They cannot do much after that. Droplets, because I was trying to think of cards that are helpful against decks that we have problems with, and this deck struggles against the Buster Blader deck, and it also struggles against Dragoon in general, just like any Zoo deck does, and this just outs that problem. I wouldn't really side this in against any other matchup because I don't feel like it's necessary, unless you're really afraid of the Zoo matchup and not comfortable playing against that deck. You could side this in, but really it's like you're using 2 resources to negate the effects of 1 card your opponent controls, and if they have any interaction whatsoever outside of that, you're still going to lose. So it doesn't seem worth it in a value proposition kind of way, but, take that with a grain of salt, use it when you're comfortable. Cyclone is another card that I'm a little iffy on. You could also play Twin Twister since you're playing 3 Avarice, while you still want to manage your resources very carefully. You can be a little bit more reckless than you normally would since you're playing 3 Avarice, but, once again, something to take with a grain of salt. Cyclone is just good against, the Eldritch matchup. It's not terrible in the mirror. You could hit 10 key in a top decking war if your opponent's playing Zoo. You might be able to snipe a Strike or a Judgment. It has applications. It's good. And then Feather Duster, because it's at 1, it's a better Lightning Storm. You don't have to control no face-up cards to activate it. It's good if you top deck it, unlike Lightning Storm. It's a more powerful Twin Twister in the form of just mass removal without having to discard anything. It's just a great card. And then lastly, one card that I really overlooked when I was talking about Pure Zoo in the last video is Red Reboot. The reason why I missed this is because I'm a total chimp and I didn't think about its interaction with AA Zeus. If your opponent tries to Judgment the summon of something, you can Red Reboot, or if they activate any trap card, you can Red Reboot. And if you have access to a Zoo card, then unless they have Veiler or maybe Ghost Mourner, your Zeus will be resolving. If they set another trap card, it's just one more resource that you send to the graveyard. They can't activate traps for the rest of the turn. You're attacking directly, overlaying into Zeus, and then using Zeus's effect to send all the cards on the field to the graveyard. So it's really good against trap-heavy decks. I would say you would see this being applicable potentially in the mirror match, potentially, post game 1 or 2. If you're going second, your opponent's going to be setting up trap cards, here and there. Just something to be very, privy to when you're deck building is interactions like that. So those are kind of my thoughts on the card choices and the deck itself. Really nothing too crazy, I feel. Very, very strong, very heavy in the control aspect. Definitely the second best. I'm considering playing this or giving it another shot over Pure. While I don't think it'll change my opinions on Pure being the best, I think it is one that you can freely swap to once you're comfortable playing Zoo. So now that we're at the tail end here, I want to thank everybody for watching this video. I want to thank you all for the support in the last video. We've got to, I'm looking at it now, 232 views coming up on 2 days here. That is insane. It is the first video I've ever made. I'm very, very pleased with how it turned out and the reception that I got. There's a lot of nice comments on Facebook, a lot of good discussions had. So yeah, I look forward to making more of these videos. There should be, I would say, maybe 4 more of these discussion videos for Zoodiac in and of itself coming, so stay tuned for those. And I'd love if you could please like this video, share it if you can, comment on it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this deck and any other build that you might want to see, any opinions you might have about this deck, anything, etc., etc. You guys are great, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you.